Well, today we have the 19th Sunday of the year. It's a familiar story about Jesus walking on the water and Peter at one point being summoned to come out and join him. And we'll take a look at this gospel. I think this is really ultimately a gospel about focus. You know, what are you going to decide to focus on in your life? Are you going to tell God how big your storms are? Or are you going to tell your storms how big your God is? Are you going to focus on the storms? Or are you going to focus on the Lord? And that's the question for you and for me. We do have a decision to make about these. It's not just, well, I'm a victim of circumstances. We do have trials that we're going to go through in this life, and the question is, will we allow those things to overwhelm us, or will we turn our focus on God and say, "Help me"? Okay, and that's kind of at the heart of a gospel like this. And we're not just a victim of our feelings. Feelings usually come from thoughts. Almost 95% of the time, they come from thoughts. So that if I run to conclusions and think about things, let's say the boss looks at you kind of bad one day, at a meeting, and you say, "Oh my gosh, she's really angry about something. I'm probably going to lose my job." That's kind of called catastrophizing. That's one way of assessing the evidence. But another way could be that he had gas paints. Or that he was looking over in your direction. He says, "Gosh, I forgot to send that memo to whatever." Again, it might have nothing to do with you or being fired or any of the sort. But you see what happens. We get some data and we think, and then that creates feelings. And so the point of this is that I think for all of us in a gospel like this, there's an invitation to decide whether we're going to just focus on the storms or the trials or the fears, or whether we're going to focus on the Lord and realize that whatever comes, come what may, it will be well with my soul. All right. So with that in mind, I'd like to look at this gospel in three, maybe we'll say four stages. The four stages, I just want to kind of rehash the three stages. But the first thing to notice in this gospel is a kind of a perceived distance that takes place. And then we'll notice beyond that, we have we move from there to that produced distress on account of perceiving that distance, and then finally a point of decision to make. All right, so the perceived distance. It starts out the gospel that after he had fed the people, he had just done the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and proceed to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. Now, after doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. So again, in this brief verse, or a couple verses, we sort of encounter the mystery of God apparently hiding his face. That is to say, he dismisses the apostles. "You go over to the other shore, I'll join you later." So he's up on the mountain alone praying, and they're out there on the sea. And as we know, a storm is coming up, or at least it's windy. And there is going to be for them something of a test. And they perceive the Lord to be not with them, to be not present with them. But I say this is a perceived distance, all right? This is, of course, articulated in a lot of places in the Bible, especially in the Psalms, where we do experience God seeming to hide his face. So, for example, in Psalm 13, "How long will you hide your face from me, O Lord? How long must I bear pain in my soul?" and so on. Or again in Psalm 30, "You hid your face, O Lord, and I was put to confusion." Or again in Psalm 44, "Why, Lord, do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and our oppression?" Goes on to say, just, of course, Jesus up on the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me?" So these are just, God knows that this is sometimes what we experience. But has God actually hidden his face? Has God actually withdrawn his presence? I would argue if he did, we would just simply cease to exist. He's holding all creation together in himself, says the letter to the Colossians, and likewise, he is absolutely immanently present to his creation and to us, because otherwise, again, as I say, everything would just fall apart, would cease to be. He's also transcendent, but he's immanently present. He's more present to you than you are to yourself, as St. Augustine puts it, right? So the distance that we perceive is perceived, but it's not real. There's one of the Desert Fathers stories saying that goes something like this. One of the disciples came to the abbot, and he said, "What am I to do about the distance that I experience from God?" And the old master said, realize that it isn't there. And the disciple said, well, does that mean that God and I are one? He says, not one, not two. Now, the Desert Fathers love these ambiguous things. Does that mean God and I are one? And he answers, not one, not two. And again, what does that mean? He says, well, the singer and his song, the ocean and its waves, the candle and its light, not one, not two. I realize it may sound like a riddle, but the thing is that we tend to divide out some things that are really so together as to be one. Now, to take the candle, for example, in our mind, we can distinguish between the candle, if you think of the candle flame, between its heat and its light in our mind. But in reality, they're so together as to be one. And the one can't really be without the other, and so on. Now, again, all analogies limp, but in effect, what we're saying is that it is really impossible for God to utterly hide his presence or block his presence from us. It's our feeling or our experience of his presence that is what we perceive as a distance, but God himself is not distant. Now, it is true that if we lose being in a state of grace, that there's a special indwelling of the Holy Spirit that we can lose. But again, that doesn't mean God is absolutely gone. We can't possibly, he's just nowhere to be seen. Okay, impossible. He's more present. He's ipsum esse subsistens, right? He's the very act of to be itself. Okay. So we see that there's a perceived distance. They're out there, and sure enough, we'll move now, if you will, to be, let's maybe examine a couple of, I have maybe some notes I just jotted down here about why it might be that we have trouble seeing God, all right? Sometimes it's simply that our minds are very weak and we're easily distracted, okay? Sometimes it's our flesh, which demands to see everything physically, refusing to accept the reality of a kind of a spiritual seeing. Sometimes it's that we insist on seeing and understanding only in ways that are acceptable and pleasing to us. So if God exists, I have to see him in these ways, or I have to get the evidence. This would be the list I would need to have, okay? And so again, and that sometimes God reveals himself paradoxically, even through our enemy, through adversity. Sometimes God is revealing his face, sometimes through a child, a painful circumstance. So God is there. He's not likely hiding, but we struggle to see him for these and other reasons. And of course, again, for our sin, right? Our sin clouds our ability to see, and it turns us in on ourself, you see. And it's pretty hard to see God when you're turned in on yourself, right? But he's there. It's a perceived distance. So here they are. They're out of the boat. And Jesus has told them, you go to the other shore. Well, how are you going to get there? That's none of their business. Okay. Or again, well, where are you going to be? None of their business. Jesus said to all of us, he says, I am with you all days until the end of the age. All right. So he's here. It's just a question of our ability to move beyond, what we kind of insist on seeing on our own terms, all right? He's there to see. It's just that we have to learn how to see him. All right, now, with this perceived distance comes a produced distress. It says, while the boat was already a few miles offshore, it was being tossed by the waves, for the wind was against it. Now, it looks like here, this isn't necessarily a heavy rainstorm with thunder and lightning, but the wind is against it, so the water's choppy. And they might be, taking on some water, and they're trying to bail the water, and so on. And so again, they're very tormented. A storm is, a windstorm at least, is making it difficult for them. It can be very windy there on the Sea of Galilee, given the way the mountains line up with the prevailing breezes. And I've been out there 4 times on the Sea of Galilee, and a couple times it was choppy. One time it was raining. So again, these things, are part of being out on a large lake like that. But don't just think about the physicality of the storm. There's more. This is an image spiritually that when we perceive God as distant, Or maybe some other people that we trust and we love and are depending on. When we think of them as being distant, we feel very anxious very quickly, and storms and things seem to come before us, and we're easily terrified. And so this is the produced distress that comes from this perceived distance. And in our spiritual life, this is a journey for us to make. We have to begin to understand, as the old master said, that God, what am I to do about the distance between me and God? Understand that it isn't there. What does that mean? Well, the artist and his song, the candle and its light, all right, the ocean and its waves, not two, not one. They're so together as to be one, even though we can distinguish the artist and his song, or the ocean and its waves, and so on. All right. So again, we see that there is a produced distress here. They're very, and the storm is kind of taking up all their attention. Okay. Well, of course, Father, they got to bail the water, and I get that. But again, spiritually, understand that very often we develop a kind of an urgency about all the wrong things. We're worried about, oh my gosh, I might lose some money or my job or whatever, and we don't seem to care if we lose our soul or go to hell. It's amazing what we get frightened about and what we don't get frightened about, you see. And it's so these are the things to say. Now, as I say, with this perceived distance comes this produced distress. Fulton Sheen kind of had a picture of, he painted, he says, you're there in the church, in the sanctuary light, the red light is there, and but as you turn and you move away, the shadows start to get longer and longer from that sanctuary light. So again, we want to stay as close as we can to the Lord, but if we don't, the shadows start to seem longer, see? So yes, there is an aspect of our sins that can hide God's face, but again, it doesn't mean he's not actually there. An old gospel song comes to mind, when the storms of life are raging, stand by me. Like when the world is tossing me like a ship upon the sea, thou who rulest wind and water, stand by me. When the host of hell assail and my strength begins to fail, thou who never lost a battle, stand by me. So in these moments, we have a decision to make. Am I going to focus on the storm and conclude that somehow God isn't present, or am I going to say, now wait a minute, I'm not alone. There's another scene, not this one, this gospel, another gospel, where Jesus is actually in the boat and he's asleep in the storm because he's focused on his Father, not the storm. He's not upset. But they are, and they finally said, hey, maybe we had better go get Jesus and wake him up. What do you think? That's how long it took them to do that. Okay, we come now to the point of decision. So we've seen that there's a perceived distance. It's not a real distance, but it's perceived, which produces a distress. Now we come to a point of decision. It says, during the fourth watch of the night, in other words, really just before dawn when they say it's darkest, during the fourth watch of the night, Jesus came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. It is a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. And at once Jesus spoke to them, and he said, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. So you see, this happens to us, that even when we do see the Lord, we misinterpret sometimes. Like I said to you earlier, is it possible that maybe the Lord could appear to you in the face of an infant? Or how about even in the face of your enemy, who might have something important that's to say to you that is of God? Even a broken clock is right twice a day, right? Do we see God in the midst of storms and so on? Well, here they're looking right at him, but they think it's a ghost. Okay. So again, God is there. He's giving us signals, but again, because we're zany brainy and fear seizes us, everything's chaotic and we just don't see correctly. And we're in a kind of a panic. And even when he shows us or gives us signs of his presence, we call them signal graces, we're very often kind of like, oh no, that's even worse. It's like, I think sometimes God closes one door to open up another, but the closing of that door, we're all seized on that. We can't see he just opened up another door over here. Or we look at it and we're even more terrified. What's that? I don't want to go there. This is the door I know. See? So again, these are the kinds of things that we have to accept, that we're not very good at seeing by faith. And we focus on storms. We tend to be negative. and we're going to have this disposition. All right. Now, we therefore see that Jesus says to them, calling out from the walking on the water, he says, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." He doesn't just say, "Don't be afraid." He says, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." In other words, focus on me. Look at me. It is I. It really is. It really is me. And so he's asking them, are you going to focus on the storm and the wind and see all? Are you going to stay in that world of panic and fear? Or are you going to look, set your eyes on me and say, it really is. It's him. It's him. And suddenly see your fears melt away? Or are you going to still focus on the storm? So again, the Lord presents us with a choice. Either focus on the storm or focus on me. He's telling them, he's not just telling them, don't be afraid. He's saying, it is I. Do not be afraid. Very important. It's the same for us. If we're going to accept the Christian life and come to more deeply and constantly experience the Lord's presence, then our fear will dissipate. But if not, it'll grow, especially as we start to get older and things seem to be less under our control. How am I going to get up these stairs? Or, oh my gosh, who will get me, to the doctor? Things can get, if we don't know the Lord's presence and haven't learned to experience kind of his serene presence, that God will work these things out. We can get very, very fearful, and it gets even worse sometimes as we grow older. See, but there's an old saying, what you feed is going to grow. If you feed the fear, it's going to grow. If you feed the trust, it'll grow. If you feed the relationship, it will grow. So again, are you going to focus on the storms, the threats, even the very theoretical and possible threats? It's amazing what we can get worked up about. Or are we going to focus on the Lord and his providence? And he's actually been pretty good to most of us. We've all had some things in our life that we puzzle over, troubles, sorrows, losses, yes. But, overall, things tend to work out just fine. I like most of you, I've had some tragic things like, oh my gosh, what's going on? My whole world's upside down. My mother died very suddenly and tragically, and my sister did the same, 15 years apart. I'm like, wow, and yet, most of the things in my life aren't like that. They kind of work out. And even if they're not perfect, God tends to come through. Okay? So we're not presumptuous. Oh, well, God will take care of whatever. But we're confident. We're not so anxious about, well, what if more people come than we have food for? Or what if nobody comes? And whatever will be, will be. But you start to see, this is going to be the question for you and me. It's the heart of the Gospels, this question. Get hold of yourselves. It's I. Don't be afraid. Look at me. See? Lay hold that I'm present to you right now in this storm. It's not a ghost. It is I. Don't look at the storm. Don't look at that. All right. So those are the three main points. We have the perceived distance, which then creates, if you will, a produced distress. And then a point of decision, which is, what am I going to do in the midst of this perceived distress? First of all, I need to realize that whatever perceived distance there is between me and God, it's only perceived. God is closer to me than I am to myself. He's immanently present to me. He indwells all of his, if you will, he holds all creation together in himself. Let's put it that way from the scriptures. Okay, so he's got this. He's holding everything together. All right. Now, let's take a little bit of a kind of, I don't know, Peter's depiction, or maybe a kind of a development here. Peter sort of lays hold of this idea. He says, if it really is you, Lord, tell me to come out on the water. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I wouldn't have done that. I bet you wouldn't have either. Come on, admit it. Would you have said this? What has happened to Peter? How did he suddenly get so much faith that he's willing to step out of a boat? Because he's heard the Lord's voice. And so it starts out so well. Peter, he hears the Lord. He says, I recognize that voice. It is him. If it really is you, Lord, tell me to come out. I know what you would tell me. You would tell me to come out on this water with you. And the Lord says, come. And Peter, in this moment, just this brief moment, is able to say, he's here. I can do it. Whatever it is, I can face it. And, wow, you see. And so he steps out. And it does, so there is this magnificent moment. And yet the text is very clear. He starts to shift his focus away from the Lord and listening to his voice. And he starts to notice how strong the winds are. It says when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened and he began to sink. You know? So he shifted his focus. And he's more present to the storm than to the Lord. All right. He says, but at least he has this in mind. He cries out, Lord, save me. And the Lord, of course, immediately grabbed Peter's hand and saves him. But he does rebuke him. He says, you see, man, you lost it. You had it for a minute, but then you lost it. Okay, now we can pick on Peter, but come on, huh? Now, I think many of us have had moments where we were almost miraculously able to step out on faith and maybe take risk, or we were able to come through a crisis, and then we fell to pieces. See? So it's interesting. We can sometimes have in the moment a certain amount of really powerful faith, and yet too easily, because our minds are very weak and wily, they start to focus on these other things. Okay, yeah, I came through all that trouble, but why did God let me fall into the trouble in the first place? Is he out to get me? And our mind starts, and we overthink it all, and all of a sudden we're back in the soup. All right. You got to keep your eyes on the prize. There's another song, I guess, by the way, this is from Hebrews. I just quote from, I want to finish with from Hebrews and then an old song, but it says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down now and he's at the right hand of God. So we keep our eyes on Christ, who went through it, but he's now seated in glory, and so too for us, so too. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus. One old song says, I woke up this morning with my mind, and it was stayed on Jesus. Right? There's another old song that says, it is well with my soul. It says, in effect, it says, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well. So it's, when peace like a river attendeth my soul, or sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well. And so, fix your focus. Decide where you're going to focus. Are you going to focus on the storm? Or are you going to focus on the one who has authority over the storm? You can say to the storm, be muzzled. And there's a great quiet. Where will you focus? Where will I? Well, I know what I tend to do. Pick up the challenge and say, Lord, help me to keep my eyes fixed on you. Amen.